Hello, everyone. I'd just like to say hello to Mr. Breslin, Mr. Plunkett, and all 5th and 6th class. And my name is Sinéad McGleenon, and I'm a teacher from Armagh, and I also work for STEAM Education. So at the minute, you're involved with the Silver Science Project, and we've got Professor Richard Roche with us today to answer all your questions, which were fantastic, on the brain, as that's what your lesson's on. And so I'll let Richard have a little chat to you, and then we'll start the questions. All right, Richard?
Yeah, thanks a million, Sinead. Hi, everyone. Lovely to meet you all, sort of virtually. Fantastic questions. They're always challenging and exciting, and a real eye-opener for me, because they're totally different type of questions to the ones I get in college, and they're often just much better because you're just curious about these things, and it's really fun to try and answer them. So I'll do my best.
All right. So we've got, I know they're in the class. We've got Danny and Charlie and Jack and Megan and Shiva and Gavin and Kelly. That's a few names I've just got. So we'll just start, and I'll say the name of the person, Richard, and then we'll answer the questions. So
sure.
The first one here is from Shiva, and Shiva wants to know, why does the brain look like it does?
That's a brilliant question. It's a funny shape. It's an odd looking thing. And when the brain is kind of developing, it starts out in a fetus as like sort of a flat kind of plate thing. And then that curls into a tube. And then the tube sort of folds over. And then around the top of it, you grow the cortex, the newest part of the brain. So that's where the sort of spinal cord connects to the rest of the brain, and the older part is that tube, and then the newer bit is the part that's around it. But the reason that it's all kind of wrinkly looking is basically to make it fit inside the skull. So I've got a little brain model there. So that weird sort of convoluted surface that it has there, it's a bit like a deflated football, and that means that it's able to fit inside our skull. It's a bit like say you had a big sheet of paper and you want to try and get the paper into like a small glass, and obviously it's way too big. So the only thing you can do, the only way you can do it is crumple it up so that it fits in the glass. And your brain is like that. So if you were to take it out and get a bicycle pump and inflate it, it would be huge. But because the skull is only so big and we can't be walking around with gigantic, huge skulls on us, the brain kind of folds in on itself and gets all crumpled and convoluted so that it's able to sort of stay inside the skull in a sort of manageable size. So that's why it looks like a sort of a walnut or something.
Oh, brilliant. That was a great question by Shiva, wasn't it? It was brilliant.
Yeah.
So now we've got Kelly, and Kelly's question is, how much does the brain weigh?
Okay, yeah, that's a good one. About 3 pounds an average brain. So that's about the same as a bag of sugar. Which, when you think about it, is heavier than you'd expect. And when you think you're kind of supporting this thing on your neck and it's kind of floating around inside your skull, that's pretty heavy. I think the heaviest they've ever recorded from a human is like about 4 pounds. So they must have had a massive head. But generally in and around the same weight of a bag of sugar, so like 1.3 kilograms or something. Yeah, something like that.
Oh, right. Great question, Kelly.
Thanks,
and Kelly. Now with Tiernan's question. If electricity doesn't like water, and our bodies are made up of 60% water, how they can mix in our brain? That's a brilliant question, Tiernan. Yeah.
It's really good because it sort of makes you stop and think and work out. Actually, that's a really good point. Yeah. So the thing about the brain is it's not so much made of water as jelly. It's kind of made of this jelly substance, like cytoplasm is the name of it. And the electrical signals that are passed in the brain, they're electrochemical. So when brain cells pass signals to each other, this chemical is released, which kind of carries an electrical charge with it. So it's not exactly the same as the electricity you get from a plug socket. It's a sort of, chemical electrical reaction that jumps across the gap between brain cells that passes signals through them. So luckily, our brain isn't really made of water, it's made of that jelly stuff. So we don't get electrocuted every time we pass signals through the brain. But it's a brilliant one because it makes you stop and retrace your steps and think, actually, why is that? So I think it's luckily because it's made of that cytoplasm, which is like that jelly stuff.
Great, Tiernan. That was a great question too. We've got now one from James. How long does it take for your brain fully to shut down after the body dies?
This is a brilliant one, yeah. And immediately I started thinking of examples where people have had their head cut off in the guillotine, and the stories where they sometimes hold up their head and the eyes are still moving and people are still able to sort of, respond and talk. In general, they say somewhere between like 20 seconds and 7 minutes. Now that's a big window of time. I think the shorter end of it, the 20 seconds or so, is probably the time it takes for higher functions to shut down. So as long as the brain is receiving blood and oxygen through the bloodstream, then it will continue to function. But once that stops, so when the heart stops or if the head is cut off, there'll be a residual bit of blood flow through the brain, whatever's left in the system. But as soon as that dries up, you'll have shutting down of higher functions, so consciousness or the ability to think, or higher order kind of stuff. But chances are the brain is still responding to stimuli, or we can still have some processing of maybe visual information or auditory information until a couple of minutes later. So there's some suggestions that the brain may be able to still hear things or see things up until a couple of minutes after the rest of the body is shut down, which is amazing when you think about it, and kind of a bit scary, but yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, that was a great question, James. So we've got Ellen now. How do the doctors in the hospital know when someone is brain dead?
Right. So for that, there's a few different ways they do it, but the main one is they record electrical activity from the scalp with what they call EEG. So that's the electroencephalogram. So you can record brain signals from the scalp if you attach electrodes, and they pick up the tiny sort of electrical charges that are released when brain cells talk to each other. So if you get to the point where you've got somebody, say, in a coma or who is unresponsive, and their brain activity stops showing any signs of being active or being alive, then that's when they'll conclude that the person is brain dead. So they might be paralyzed, but their brain could still be active. And you see that in conditions like ALS, or what Stephen Hawking had, where he couldn't really control his body, but his brain was perfectly fine. So looking at those electrical signals gives you a clue as to whether the brain is still operating or not. And when those signals kind of flatline and stop showing any signs of activity, that's when they might conclude that the person's unresponsive or brain dead.
All right. Thank you. That was another brilliant question. So now we've got Turla, and his question is, why do colorblind people see different colors to normal people who aren't colorblind?
Right. So yeah, that's a really cool one. And it's more a question, not so much of the brain as the eye. Now, some people kind of suggest that the eye is really an extension of the brain. But at the back of your eye, on the retina, which is like the responsive surface at the back of your eye, if you say that's your retina, around the edges of it are a type of cell, and they're technically brain cells, called rod cells. And they're called that because they're shaped like rods. They're sort of long tubes. And the rod cells, they're good for picking up movement or using your vision when it's dark. So that's why if you're walking around at nighttime, if you'll be able to detect movement in the periphery of your vision very easily, because those rod cells are spread around the outside. But around the middle, very center of your retina, are different types of cells called cone cells. And again, they're shaped like cones, so they're like traffic cones. And there's 3 types of them. So there's 3 different forms of cone cell, and they're specialized for processing colors like red, green, and blue. So those 3 cone cells allow you to perceive all the different colors that we can look at, because all colors are kind of combinations of those 3. Now, in someone who's colorblind, you have a problem with maybe a couple of those types of cone cells. So the red and the green ones might not be processing the way they usually do. Or in some people, it might be missing altogether. So you might not have, let's say, the red ones. So that means that when the signal gets to your brain is actually fine. It's just that you haven't taken in any information in the red or the green end of the color spectrum. So the brain doesn't have as much information to process when it gets to the visual parts of your brain at the very back. So that's kind of what happens in cases of color blindness. But the flip side of that is, the way I said there are 3 types of cone cells. Some people, it's very rare, but some people have a 4th type of cone cell as well in their brain, in the retina. So that means that people who have this condition, It's called tetrachromacy. And people like that are able to perceive hundreds more colors than the rest of us. So I've got a picture. I'll give you an example of, this is a painting by an artist who has tetrachromacy. And this kind of shows that when she looks at something that we probably see as green, she sees all sorts of different colors in it. So she might see all these different kind of hues and different subtle kind of elements of color in, let's say, an area of grass that we would just typically process as being green. So they say that people with tetrachromacy they're able to process something like 10,000 more colors than the rest of us, which is the opposite end of the spectrum to color blindness. So it's really to do with what part of that window of the visual spectrum we're able to actually process, which is kind of cool.
Brilliant. That was great. Yeah. Lovely painting there. That was lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then we've got the Aidan. We have a question here from Aidan. Does your brain make you feel pain?
Right. Yeah. This is the really interesting thing. So the brain itself, it doesn't contain any pain receptors. So people can have surgery on their brain while they're awake and conscious with just a local anesthetic. So they can be wide awake and talking to the doctor while the doctor does things with their brain, which is really strange. So the other aspect of it is if you, let's say, you hit your thumb with a hammer, you feel the pain in your thumb, but that pain signal is actually being processed in your brain. So it's really your brain that creates the feeling of pain, even though it's your thumb that you've hurt. And again, I've got a slide to best kind of capture this. My friend Andy made this cool cartoon where he basically said, yeah, if you hurt your thumb, that's actually what's active. It's that part of your brain that's responding, because in this strip in your brain, it's called the somatosensory strip, there's a map of your entire body. So if you hurt your hand, there's an area of the brain here that will respond. If you bang your foot, there's an area further down that will be active. So even though it's happened in your limbs, out in your body, it's happening in another sense in your brain. So it's your brain that causes you to feel the pain. But on the other hand, the brain itself doesn't feel any pain. So you can have open brain surgery without having anything more than a local anesthetic, which is really interesting and really unusual.
Mm. That's amazing, isn't it? That is unreal. Yeah, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
Then we've got Mr. Plunkett, the teacher, has asked a question.
Yeah.
When does the brain begin functioning in a fetus?
Right. This is another brilliant one. And it kind of depends on what you mean by functioning and what you mean by brain in some respects. So in the early weeks of life, when you've got a fetus in the womb, like I said, the brain starts off with that tube and it sort of curls around and then the cortex grows on top of it. So usually that starts to happen around about like 5 or 6 weeks into the whole process. And then by between 5 and say 8 weeks, the organs are starting to develop, including the brain. But it's only from about that period onwards, maybe 8 or 9 weeks onwards, that you start to get actual brain cells showing up. So neurons start to appear and start to form connections. And then later on, a few months into the pregnancy, typically you start to actually see the brain responding to stimuli. So you start to get the sense organs developing. So you've got the eyes and the ears and the nose. So information starts to be processed. So in a way, you could consider that to be the brain starts to be functioning. But even then, up until birth and then into the first 4 or 5 years of life, the brain is still evolving, it's still developing, it's still becoming more connected and more complex. And if you think about it, the brain, it doesn't really stop developing until adolescence and even adulthood. So even though it kind of, in a way, it could be considered to start functioning from a couple of months into the pregnancy, you might consider it an actual brain maybe closer to like 6 months into the pregnancy in terms of what it can process and how it can respond to different stimuli. But even up until like the first 4 or 5 years of life, it's still becoming a brain, if you like, because it's only, around the age of 4 or 5, you get a lot of change and a lot of growth and a lot of pruning in the frontal areas, which are the most important for like higher reasoning. And then in adolescence, something similar happens again. So Yeah, it's a tricky question. But yeah, there is something there that corresponds to the brain from very early on, but it only starts to be a brain, I'd say, a few months into pregnancy, which is a
Brilliant,
tricky
okay.
answer to a really good question.
Yeah. Now we've got Megan. Megan has a few questions, or two or three questions here. So the first one is, why is there fluid around the brain?
Right. So this is a great one. So that fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid that surrounds the brain, it's really important, and it has 3 or 4 different functions. So one of them is to kind of provide nutrients to the brain. Another one is to basically wash the brain, to remove waste materials. But probably the most important function is it helps to protect the brain. So if you think of your brain in the skull, this model isn't great because in reality, the brain is actually sitting inside a bag of fluid. So there's this bag, which is called the meninges, is full of this cerebrospinal fluid. And that bag is inside another bag of fluid, which is inside another bag of fluid. So you've got a brain in a bag, in another bag, in another bag, which is inside your skull. And that helps to protect the brain from damage and from impacts, because the brain's really fragile and it's very sensitive to damage from, a blow to the head, for example. So if you go back to our brain in a glass here, if you imagine your brain is a little bit like a goldfish in a goldfish bowl. So if you've got your goldfish in a bowl and you whack the side of the bowl, the water will slosh around a bit, but the goldfish will be fine. It won't actually feel the impact very much. So if you imagine then that you've got a goldfish in a bowl, which is inside another bowl, which is inside another bowl, which is then inside a crash helmet, that's how protected your brain is. And that'll give you an idea of how hard a blow it takes to your head to really cause brain injury. Now, there's not a huge amount of space around each of those bags of fluid, but it's really a way of keeping the brain safe from impacts that happen. So that's a brilliant question.
Great, another great question, yeah. Have you ever treated somebody with West syndrome, and why is it so difficult to treat?
I haven't, because I'm not really sort of a clinician. I'm more of a sort of lab-based neuroscientist, but I have heard of it, and it's a really interesting, quite rare condition, I think, which involves problems like almost like epileptic type seizures and tremors that happen to the body. There's an element of intellectual disability as well. And I think it seems quite hard to treat because there are different elements to it. So I think the seizures and the spasms that happen can be treated with certain medications that deal with convulsive type problems. But then you've also got the intellectual disability problem as well, which is harder to treat. So I think that combination makes it quite tricky to work with and to get good interventions for. But there is a lot of work with rare diseases happening more recently, and there's a whole Centre for Rare Diseases that's been set up. So hopefully with more research and a better understanding of how these conditions arise, they might have some progress in helping to treat conditions like that.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. Then this is the final one from Megan. Does your brain grow?
Yeah, another great question. It does all the time, basically. So I know I was talking before about how it turns from a plate into a tube into the brain, and then even after you're born, it'll be growing right up through adolescence and into like early adulthood. But it turns out that the brain never really stops growing in a way. There's this process called plasticity, which they only kind of really started to talk about in the last 20 years or so, that shows us everything we do and everything we experience changes the connections in our brain. So you often hear these headlines like, oh, whatever, this changes your brain. But the truth is everything does. Being conscious and creating memories or just kind of experiencing things, that changes these pathways in your brain physically. So you get new connections and new pathways being created that represent those events and that you can use to recall them later. And that's what memories are. So in a way, our brain is constantly changing and constantly growing and forming new connections and getting rid of old connections that we don't use anymore. So in a way, it never stops growing. Everything we do causes brain cells to grow and to, like a tree, to make new connections and sprout new sort of pathways to other cells, which is really, really exciting, actually.
Brilliant, brilliant.
Yeah.
We've got two other questions here then. Oren has asked, what happens with the brain when you have multiple sclerosis?
Okay, so yeah, multiple sclerosis is a problem to do with communication between the brain cells. So each of your brain cells, and there's somewhere in the region of 100 billion of them, they all make connections or pass signals to other brain cells, and they form these networks and chains or circuits to send information from the brain out to the rest of the body. And these brain cells, they have a sort of a long tubular part, which is called the axon, and then that leads to these like branches at the end. So if you imagine my arm as a brain cell, this is the axon, and it sends signals out via these end points at the end of it onto the next cell, which is over there. What happens very often in the brain is around these long tubular bits, the axons, there's a coating, kind of like an insulation that you have on an electrical wire. And it's made of this stuff called myelin. And that helps the signal to get passed more quickly. So you've got this coating on the outside of those axons in the brain, and that helps to pass these signals on to the next cell and to the next one and to the next one. But sometimes in conditions like MS or motor neuron disease or other problems like that, this coating isn't there. So it isn't fully covering the axon, or it's not there at all. And that means that the signals being passed aren't as effective or as efficient in sending a message, let's say, to the body to move the arms or the legs. So that means there's motor problems and they can't necessarily control their body the way they'd like to. So it's a problem with the insulation around brain cells that causes the signal to be passed not as effectively as it should be.
Oh, right. And now this is the last question from Jack. And this question is, which type of sport is best for your brain?
Okay. Yeah, there's a load you can talk about here. So there's definitely some sports that aren't great for your brain. So anything where you get hit in the head is probably not ideal. And there's been research about boxing and even football. If you do a lot of heading of the ball, that can lead to problems in later life just through those repeated impacts. So some sports aren't great. But in terms of sports that are good for your brain, things that keep you mentally challenged and mentally active. So I'd say maybe stuff like chess or games like Scrabble or doing Sudokus or crosswords, anything that challenges you and forces you to think. Even doing things like maths and mathematical problems, that forces those connections to be made between brain cells, and that can keep the brain in really good shape. And they found that often in later life, after people retire, say if they're not working regularly anymore, they don't get challenged as much as they would have when they were in a job. They find that by doing things like Scrabble or playing bridge or doing crosswords or Sudoku, stuff like that, that seems to keep their brain healthy much longer into later life. So anything that keeps your mind challenged, I'd say. But even something like if you're playing darts and you have to constantly be subtracting your score from 501 as it goes down, or in snooker, if you're trying to work out if you need snookers or not, those mental calculations would be really good for your brain as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, that's all the questions, Richard. They were fantastic. Great class.
Thanks so much. They were really good. They really had me on my toes, though. So I had to do some homework beforehand to make sure I knew what I was talking about.
We definitely have. I think definitely out there's some definite scientists and maybe future neuroscientists, because the questions were amazing.
It sounds like it. Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much. They were great, and I always enjoy those questions because I never know what's going to come out. So it's good fun.
Well, I think that's us then, Richard. So we'll end the video here, and we'll just hope that the school enjoy the rest of Science Week Ireland and keep studying hard in science and enjoying it, and that's the main thing.
Yeah, thanks again, everyone. Look after your brains, and yeah, sure, I might see you again someday.